My Billionaire Mom. Chapter 1. Get up, a cold voice rang in Chuck Cannon's ear. The next second, the quilt on him was completely lifted. Chuck rubbed his eyes and looked at the woman. He sighed and felt a little uncomfortable. The beautiful woman in front of him was Yvette Jordan, who was 4 or 5 years older than Chuck was. She was adopted by Chuck's grandfather, was groomed to be his bride since young. But since his grandfather's death, her attitude towards Chuck has become more and more terrible. You useless piece of trash, your face even pisses me off. Yvette's beautiful face was full of disgust. Chuck frowned and decided not to take Yvette's words to heart. Let me tell you, I have done my best to support you. If you don't behave yourself, I will chase you out of this house. Chuck put on his clothes and clenched his fists. But you are my wifey. No, I'm not. It was your grandfather who forced me to marry you. Did he ever ask me if I agreed? How could I marry a good-for-nothing like you? Chuck put on his clothes and stood in front of Yvette. Wifey, don't call me wifey. I'll warn you for the last time. The money that you used to eat and drink is now mine. If you dare to call me wifey, I'll let you die on the streets. Yvette snorted coldly and looked at Chuck with disdain. But I'm sure that a trash like you won't be able to survive on the streets for long. Since Grandpa left, such humiliation was no longer strange to Chuck. His fragile self-esteem has almost been crushed by Yvette. Sometimes Chuck doubted that he was really a piece of trash. Wife, Yvette, I don't have any money. Chuck took a deep breath. He was just a freshman this year, and Yvette was not only a university lecturer, she owned the company. She was a rich person. Look at yourself, you look like a beggar. It's disgusting. Yvette looked at Chuck irritatingly. Then she took out $200 from her bag and threw it on the ground. Then she turned around and left. Looking at the money on the ground, Chuck clenched his fists. In the end, he didn't pick up the money on the ground. He walked out of the house with his remaining self-esteem. Yvette's BMW drove out of the garage as Chuck stood by the roadside and watched. He was in the same university as Yvette, so they were heading in the same direction. However, Yvette's car did not stop but drove past Chuck. Get out of here and take the bus. A piece of trash doesn't deserve a ride in my car. After saying that, Yvette stepped on the accelerator and left. Chuck gritted his teeth and looked at the BMW that had disappeared at the end of the road. His eyes were slightly red. Yvette, you have gone too far. He was penniless now. His lunch money these days were borrowed from his classmates, and today was the day to return the money. Unfortunately, the $200 was too burdensome, and he couldn't pick it up. When he arrived at school, his worst fears came true. As soon as he walked to the school gate, Chuck happened to meet a student who lent money to him. Laura Jean was buying milk tea outside the school gate. When she saw Chuck, who was in a state of loss, she reached out and said, "Chuck, it is time to pay back my money, isn't it?" Chuck wanted to bury himself out of shame. He scratched his hair and said with embarrassment, "Well, give me one more day, I'll do part-time work. I'll pay you back the money latest by tomorrow." "No, how long have you been delaying? You have to return the money to me today," Laura said coldly, and there was no room for negotiation in her tone. Chuck sighed. "But I don't have any money now." "You don't have money? Don't you have parents to ask for it? Are you an orphan?" Chuck clenched his fists tightly. For as long as he could remember, he had been living with his grandfather. However, being called an orphan by Laura made him feel even more uncomfortable. "You're really an orphan? Well, I'll give you an extension until this afternoon, but you have to pay me $400. If you don't pay me back, I'll ask my boyfriend to bring someone to deal with you," Laura warned and left. "If you don't pay me back, I'll ask my boyfriend to bring someone to deal with you," Laura warned and left. Chuck stood still in his tracks. He was extremely sad. He had had enough of such humiliation. Just as Chuck was thinking about what part-time job he was going to do, his phone rang. Chuck looked at the caller ID and saw that it turned out to be a foreign number. He was afraid that it was probably a swindler. However, when he thought of the online recruitment of mercenaries in Syria, which was quite popular recently, offering $8,000 a day, he became interested again. Although he knew it could be a scam, if it was true, he would definitely go to Syria without hesitation. "Hello," Chuck greeted unexpectedly. A flurry of words in Mandarin from the other end of the phone. "Chucky, I am your mother." Chuck was shocked. He first felt that he had been made fun of by others, but then he felt extremely sad. How could he have a mother? "Chucky, don't blame me. I had no choice but to go abroad these years, but now I can finally return home. I will try my best to make up for the lost time with you." I will transfer $5 million and you can use it first. If it is all spent, call me. The strange conversation ended in a weird atmosphere. As soon as the call ended, a message arrived. Your account with the ending number 0123 has been credited with $5 million and the current balance is $5 million and 83 cents. Chuck was dumbfounded. His mother, whom he had never seen before, actually gave him $5 million? He looked at the text message and counted the zeros, again and again, repeatedly confirming it more than a dozen times, and then went to the ATM to check if it was correct. He was ecstatic. That was $5 million. What more, it was his mysterious mother who casually gave him pocket money. Even Yvette, who was busy with her business, had less than $1 million including her car and her savings. Chuck giggled and walked to the campus. At this time, Yvette, who was going to the public building for class, said with disgust after seeing Chuck, "Why aren't you in class but instead laughing here stupidly?" "I am not going to class anymore." Chuck stood where he was and watched Yvette quietly. Yvette felt a little strange. She seemed to see a confident look in Chuck's eyes. Isn't he still the useless piece of trash? How dare he argue with her? Yvette was angry. How dare you talk back at me? If you have the guts, don't come to my house today. Chuck was also tired of being treated coldly by Yvette. He said disdainfully, "I am not going back, I'll sleep elsewhere. Is this a joke? Now that I have $5 million, I don't need to look at Yvette's unhappy face anymore." Chuck thought to himself. Great, I'd like to see how brave you are. From now on, if you dare to enter my house, I'll break your legs. Chuck ignored Yvette and directly turned his back and left the school. Yvette stomped her feet angrily, but she couldn't do anything about it, so she turned around and went to class. Chuck, who had left school, took a taxi to the real estate agency in the city center. With this sum of money, the first thing Chuck wanted to do was to have his own house. After pushing the door open and entering, the real estate agency employees did not pay attention to Chuck, who was dressed ordinarily. This kind of person was either looking for a part-time job, begging for food, or the type who was interested in buying anything but just trying to enjoy the air-conditioned room. Later, when the manager of the store came out of the office, those lazy employees hurried up and asked, "Sir, what do you want?" "I want to buy a house." "To buy a house?" Natalie Xavier's big eyes narrowed. She stared at Chuck carefully for a long time. She had been a real estate agent for so long, but she had rarely misjudged someone. There may be 1 in 1,000 customers who would buy a house at less than 20 years old like Chuck, but all of them wore branded suits and drove high-end sport cars. "Sir, for your information, the cheapest house in the city is around $12,000 per square meter. Are you sure you want to buy it?" Natalie didn't want to waste time on this kind of person, so her tone became impatient. Chapter 2. Natalie didn't want to waste time on this kind of person, so her tone became impatient. "Yes, the cheapest one is $12,000, which means that a house of 100 square meters costs about $1 million. Even the smallest apartment costs $50,000 or $60,000. You must listen carefully, sir." Natalie Xavier was very dismissive of this kind of person who was overconfident and maliciously delayed time. "Well, Chuck Cannon didn't finish his words. At this time, a pot-bellied man walked into the real estate agency. The gold necklace on his neck was thicker than his fingers, and he looked like a rich man at first glance. Natalie immediately chose to leave Chuck aside and greeted the man with a smile. It was totally different from the way she treated Chuck. When Natalie saw the fat man, she immediately put on a happy smile. "Sir, do you want to buy a house?" "Yes, I want to buy a house. Introduce some high-quality housing sources to me." Natalie smiled even more happily. Yes, we have plenty of high-quality houses for you with our high-end services. Unlike some people who come to us even when they can't afford it. It's a waste of time." Natalie gave Chuck a disdainful look as she spoke, implying and cursing him. Chuck looked at Natalie's attitude and felt disheartened. He was used to being looked down upon. At that time, he didn't dare to say anything because he didn't have any money. But now, he had $5 million. How could he swallow such humiliation? "Where is your manager? Call your manager over." Hearing Chuck's words, Natalie sneered and said, "Do people like you still have the right to meet our manager? Don't make a fool of yourself here. Get out of here. Do you know that wasting our time affects how much money we make?" The manager walked slowly over at this time. As a service industry, it was a taboo to be rude to customers. "What's going on, Natalie?" Natalie hurriedly explained, "Sir, this broke idiot isn't trying to buy a house. He just wants to enjoy the air conditioning here. I'll get him out of here immediately." The manager eyeballed Chuck's clothes from top to bottom and saw that he was dressed ordinarily. Indeed, as Natalie said, he didn't look like someone who could afford to buy a house. More importantly, he was too young to buy a house, as he looked just 18 or 19 years old. No one would believe he had the ability to. Chuck did not say anything. He stood up and walked to the real estate agency next door. Can't afford a house? Seems that you're not the only real estate agency here. Natalie looked down on him. How is a poor person like you able to buy a house? You can't even afford to buy a toilet. Some employees laughed at him. He's afraid of making a fool of himself. He quickly found an excuse to run away. He said he wanted to go next door, but he just might be trying to take advantage of the air conditioning there too. Still pretending even when you're gone, Natalie sneered. They were familiar with the next door real estate agency. They also knew whether they could sell it or not. After watching Chuck leave, Natalie hurriedly ran to the fatty and smiled apologetically. I'm sorry to keep you, boss. Sorry to keep you waiting. The fatty shook his head and said, It's okay. It's okay. However, no matter how Natalie greeted him with a smile, the fatty never talked about money. In the end, Natalie's patience was exhausted and she even began to plead. At this moment, all the employees of the real estate agency looked outside. Under the respectful guidance of the staff next door, Chuck got into the Mercedes-Benz, which was specially used to take a customer to see a room. What was going on? Generally speaking, only a person who bought a house could enter this car. Didn't the next door real estate agency see that this rascal didn't have the ability to buy a house at all? The fatty saw that the people here was distracted, so he quickly sneaked out. Natalie turned around and looked at the customer that just disappeared. She was so angry that she stomped her feet. She didn't expect that the fatty, who was putting on airs and graces, was actually here to enjoy the air conditioning too. Natalie looked at Chuck disgustedly and disliked him even more. She sneered and said, Such a pretentious person. Even imitating others to inspect a house. At this time, an employee next door came quickly. He opened the door and said, Thank you. You sent such an important customer to our company. We haven't run into any big business in the past 2 years. Today is a big day. Important customer? The manager's face darkened and he immediately asked, What did he buy? He bought a house worth more than $3 million with a deposit of $1 million. The business should be successful. Thank you. I'll treat you to a cup of milk tea later. After that, the employee got on the Mercedes-Benz and took Chuck to take a look at the house. Really, bought it? Natalie's face was full of disbelief. Looking at Chuck, who was sitting in the Mercedes-Benz with a smile on his face, she felt very uncomfortable. How could it be possible? He is so poor, how could he afford to buy a house? Smack. Before she could blame herself, the manager raised his hand and slapped her in the face. His eyes were almost bursting out flames. Look at what you've done. If the transaction was successful, the employees who have dealt with him would have been given a 5% commission, which would have been around $150,000. As for the manager, he would have gotten a 10% commission amounting to $300,000. But now, the manager trembled with anger when he thought of $300,000 gone with the wind. He kicked Natalie and said, Get out. You're fired. Get out. Natalie was also losing her mind. Ignoring the pain on her body, she quickly ran outside and threw herself on the BMW. She knocked on the window repeatedly and looked at Chuck, sobbing, Sir, I am sorry. I am really sorry. I failed to recognize your wealth before and I'm a snob. Please give me another chance. We have better houses here. Chuck shook his head and said, It's all right. You can save it for the other customers. After that, the Mercedes-Benz started in a hurry. Natalie chased after him all the way and finally sat on the ground. She looked weakly at the Mercedes-Benz getting farther and farther away. Thud. The manager threw Natalie's personal belongings out of the door and yelled at her. Get out of here. Don't let me see you here again. Chuck Cannon was quite satisfied with the house. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, and 3 bathrooms. Located in the downtown area, the business district was more prosperous and there was a lot of room for renovation. $3.5 million was paid in a lump sum graciously. The salesman had not seen such a rich man for a long time, and his face was full of admiration and envy. He then took the initiative to send Chuck back to the university. When he arrived at the university, Chuck nodded and said, You can drop me here. The salesman smiled respectfully and said, All right, take care, sir. The process of transferring the house should be completed tomorrow and you should be able to move in the day after tomorrow. Okay. Chuck nodded and decided to stay in an hotel for the time being for the next 2 days. However, What he wanted to know more was how Yvette would feel when she saw that his house was 3 or 4 times bigger than hers. When they arrived at the gate, Chuck first took out $20,000 before strolling into the university. There were not many classes in the afternoon, but Chuck had already been absent for a whole class, because he had been held up outside for a while. Seeing Chuck walking into the classroom, Laura Jean sneered, "Who is this? Isn't this Chuck, the beggar of our class? I'm telling you, don't lend your money to such a person. When you lend him money, he acts as if you're his savior and bows to you. However, when you try to get the money back from him, he acts shamelessly like a scam trying to eat off your money. Speaking of which, he hasn't paid me my money until now. Oh, this guy doesn't have parents. Who knows which bastard he learnt these tactics from?" The whole class burst into laughter. Chapter 3. The whole class burst into laughter. They all knew that Chuck Cannon was a poor man, as he always seemed to wear 2 shirts all year round. Although there were no strange smell, but the clothes were so faded and torn that they were simply unsightly. Someone asked, "Laura Jean, how much does he owe you?" $400. "It is only a day's expenses for me, but for him, maybe a month. Putting aside how much he owes me, this person is really disgusting. He doesn't deserve to lick my shoes." Chuck's expression was indifferent. He looked at Laura, taking $400 from his bag, saying, "I was really grateful when you were willing to lend me some money when I was starving. But you just slandered me. Let's call it even now." Laura frowned at the money in his hand. She asked coldly, "Did you steal it or rob it?" Someone said, "Let's check our pockets to see if we are short of money." "I earned it myself," Chuck said calmly. "You?" Laura sneered and said, "Why not take a look at yourself in the mirror? How did you earn yourself $400 in the morning? Did you sell your body or something?" The whole class burst into laughter, and someone said, "I'm afraid this guy is not worth so much money even if he goes to sell himself." Seeing as so many students laughed at him in the classroom, Chuck sat back and sighed. "Laura, you should be easier on people." Laura snorted and said, "Then tell me what you have done. Answer some of our questions." Chuck frowned for a long time and made up an excuse. He said casually, "I picked up the money." "Oh, lucky H." Laura sneered, her malicious tone full of envy. The other students asked with jealousy, "Hey, how much did you pick?" Many students were interested and asked one after the other, "Yes, tell me, how much did you pick up?" Chuck was speechless. He stared back at his classmates and continued to lie, 2,000. "What, you actually picked up 2,000? Damn, that's my living expenses for more than a month." All the students were surprised and envied him so much. If they had his luck and picked up 2,000, their lives would be more comfortable and easier. HMPH, you suck. Picking other people's money and claiming it as your own, such an embarrassment for our class. When these classmates ridiculed Chuck because of jealousy, Queenie Carson was the only one that stood up for him in the class. But Chuck did not care about such gossip and talk. He just let them talk about it. After class, Chuck went to Yvette Jordan's staff room. Because there was no class in the afternoon, Yvette was listening to music in the staff room. When she saw Chuck, her expression soured. "What are you doing here? Didn't I tell you that you are not allowed to look for me between classes?" Chuck said with a wry smile, "I just wanted to tell you that I'm going to move out today." "You are moving out? Are you kidding?" Yvette sneered. Since young, she had grown up with Chuck. Knowing him like the back of her hand, how could he move out? Does he want to sleep on the streets? But he had been timid as a child, even insisting to use her as his body pillow when sleeping. If not for the death of his grandfather, God knows how long she would have to be hugged by him to sleep. Such a person sleeping on the streets? He wouldn't even dare to do that if he had 10 times the courage. "I am not joking with you. I am moving out today," Chuck said seriously. "Well, let's see how long you can. Don't come to me begging like a dog." "I won't." After Chuck had finished talking, he turned around and left the office. Yvette stared at his leaving figure thoughtfully. In the past, no matter how much she scolded him, he wouldn't dare to talk back. God knows what happened to him today. All of a sudden, her phone rang. After picking up the phone, she quickly changed her tone and said, "Hello, Director Chester. What happened for you to suddenly call me up like this?" A middle-aged man's voice could be heard from the other end of the phone. "Yvette, I heard that your training company business is not doing good recently. Do you want me to introduce some business to you?" Yvette's heart was filled with joy. Her business in the training company could be said to be very poor. It was already very difficult for her to make any progress. If she did not show any improvement again, she was afraid she would have to close the company in less than a year. She had already lost more than $100,000 in the past 2 months. It was also because of this that she was recently venting out all her anger on Chuck. After hearing Director Chester's business proposal, a smile appeared on her face. Yes, thank you for taking care of me, Director Chester. Well, room no 1218 in the Triumph Hotel tonight. Come over. A hotel? Yvette was a little scared. Director Chester, why don't I treat you to a 5-star hotel in the urban area? A hotel? What's wrong? You don't even give me face? No, it's just that a hotel. Immediately, a steeled voice was heard from the phone. HMPH, forget it if you don't come. This business is given by my friend's company as his employees need to be trained. You should know how much money you can make from a big company with 50 to 60 people. If you don't come, I won't force you. Yvette was very conflicted. She didn't want to go, but she didn't want to waste this opportunity either. Just when she had wanted to negotiate, he hung up on all of a sudden. If I don't take the risk, I'm afraid that I'll be going bankrupt. She decided to take the risk. After leaving school, she drove home, planning to simply tidy up and change her clothes. However, when she just arrived at the door of her house, she saw Chuck coming out of the house with a suitcase. The two of them looked at each other. Chuck said, "Wifey?" As soon as he spoke, Yvette said with disgust, "Don't call me like that. Yvette, no matter what, you've been taking care of me for almost a year after Grandpa's death. If you..." Yvette snorted and said, "What's wrong? Do you regret it? Do you want me to give you a second chance?" Yvette sneered impatiently. "No, I mean if you have any difficulties in the future, you can call me." Chuck nodded before walking past Yvette. After all, he and Yvette had been sleeping on the same bed for so long. He still has some feelings for her in his heart. Yvette was also absent-minded for a moment. She didn't expect that this man, whom she had looked down on, would say such comforting words today. It was as though in a trance, she had found someone to rely upon. But then, she smiled coldly and said, "Tell you? What good would it bring to me? Can you give me money or bring me some customers? You can't give me anything and you can't even afford a meal yet you want me to tell you?" Chuck shrugged. He still had more than $1 million in his hand. Even if it was not enough, he still had his mother. The money would be transferred to his account with just a phone call. "If you need money, I can give it to you." Yvette feebly waved and sneered, "You'd better keep the money to buy yourself instant noodles." Chuck did not defend himself. He left with his suitcase. Chuck walked with his suitcase for a while. After inquiring about the hotels nearby, he got on a taxi and went to the Triumph Hotel. The magnificent buildings, the glorious decorations and the luxurious European interiors shocked him to the core. This was the busiest hotel in the city, which cheapest standard rooms cost at least $800. In the past, Chuck did not dare to think that he could spend in such a place, but now it was different. When Chuck was about to go in, he saw Yvette's car swerving in and packing itself in the parking lot. Chuck was so shocked that he hid aside in a hurry. This is a hotel. What is she doing here? Chuck felt extremely bitter in his heart. Is his wifey going to sleep with another man? Although the two of them didn't get a marriage certificate and it was just Grandpa's arrangement, he felt very uncomfortable when he thought that the woman he once held in his arms was going to sleep with another man. After Yvette walked in, Chuck took his luggage and went in too. As soon as he entered the door, he heard a strange voice saying, "Oh my God, who is this? Isn't this Chuck?" Chuck turned his head and saw Laura walking in with her boyfriend, Conrad Lee, in her arms. Laura's face was full of scorn as if Chuck was not qualified to come to such a high-end hotel. "Who is this?" Conrad asked and glanced at Chuck casually. "Chuck Cannon, my classmate. I'm telling you, this guy picked up $2,000, but he didn't return it and spent it on himself instead. I really admire this kind of person." Conrad glanced at Chuck, the corners of his mouth twitching in sarcasm. "Haha, maybe such a trash hasn't seen $2,000 before. Don't talk nonsense with this kind of rubbish. Let's go in quickly, my dear." Laura held Conrad's arm in her arms as if she couldn't wait to enter the hotel. Chuck frowned slightly and ignored them, dragging his luggage into the hotel. "A standard room, please." Conrad took out his identity card, and Laura followed suit slightly. The pretty staff at the front desk checked on the hotel's database and said, "I'm sorry, today's standard room has been fully booked." Laura's face was full of dissatisfaction and loss. Conrad continued to ask, "What about a larger room?" "I'm really sorry." The pretty staff at the front desk checked again, her tone extremely apologetic. "Only the presidential suite is currently available." Conrad probed carefully. "The presidential suite? How much is that?" He said so in an hesitant tone. For them, They usually get a standard room that costs a few $100s when they got a room. As students, it was already pretty extravagant for them to spend a few $100s like this. Yes, it's $8,888 for the presidential suite. Conrad shook his head hurriedly. No, it's way too expensive. Forget it, let's go find another hotel, Laura muttered and pulled Conrad out. But before they went out, they saw Chuck walking to the front desk. This rubbish really thinks that he is rich after picking $2,000. Just look at his beggar-looking clothes. How dare he try to book a room in this kind of place? Laura sneered. Conrad also sneered. He was pretty sure that the guy had most $2,000 on him. He would be definitely shocked to death when he heard the price for a night in the presidential suite. However, how's that even possible? Conrad's mind was filled with doubt as he watched Chuck walking towards the elevator with the room's card in his hand. What's going on? Wasn't there no standard room? How did that trash Chuck manage to get a room? Laura Jean saw it too and she became more and more annoyed. She walked quickly to the front desk and tapped on it hard, and asked defiantly, "Hey, didn't you just say that there was no standard room left? Why did you let that person book one then? Call your manager. I'm going to make a complaint that you're cheating your customers." Conrad's face was cold too. After all, he was a VIP member of this hotel. How could he be fooled by such a receptionist? He was full of anger. "Hurry up and call out your manager." The girl at the front desk was stunned. After a long pause, she said helplessly, "You two misunderstood me. The standard rooms are indeed all fully booked. The room that this person has booked is the presidential suite." "How is this possible?" Laura's face changed. Before she retorted hurriedly, "It's impossible. How can that broke idiot afford to book a presidential suite?" The girl at the front desk handed over the receipt which was just issued now. When the two of them saw the payment fee, their faces changed. Could it be possible that he picked more than 2,000? Probably 20,000? Conrad could only think of such a possibility. It is very likely. Laura was even more jealous. That broke idiot actually picked up $20,000. This was actually her living expenses for 1 year. What a stroke of luck. He is really good at spending money. Picking up $20,000 and spending half of it lavishly. Such a spendthrift. Laura was bitter and her face was full of discontent. Idiots are still idiots. He probably thinks that he is rich with that little sum of money. $20,000 is my dad's income for 3 or 4 days, but my dad will never waste it by booking a presidential suite. How dare a broke idiot like him even spend his slim stroke of luck like that? Hilarious. Chuck laughed disdainfully. Chuck placed his luggage in his room and went downstairs to eat. When Laura saw Chuck coming down from the elevator, she thought of something and whispered to Conrad, "This loser likes to show off, right? Why don't we play around with him for a while?" Conrad was puzzled. But how? Laura smiled and shouted at Chuck, "Hey, Chuck." Chapter 4. Laura smiled and shouted at Chuck, "Hey, Chuck." Hearing the sound from the front desk, Chuck was shocked to see that these two people had not left yet. "Where are you going?" Laura asked. Chuck replied, "To get something to eat." "Eat?" Laura was contemplating silently. For a trash like Chuck, he would probably prefer fast food on the streets even after living luxuriously. After all, he was still part of the low-class commoners who would never be able to climb up the ladders of wealth. She coughed and said seriously, "Chuck, I lend you money and you haven't thanked me, have you?" Although Chuck was disgusted by Laura's words, he nodded calmly. Although he had borrowed $200 from her and was eventually forced to pay back $400, it was evident that without the $200, he would have starved long ago. "Thanking you is what I should do." Laura sneered and continued, "My boyfriend and I haven't eaten yet. Would you like to invite us to have a meal in this hotel?" Chuck nodded. Okay, he took the bait. Laura and Conrad looked at each other. They had eaten here before. Although they ordered the most ordinary dishes, it cost at least $1,000 for a few dishes. 3 people would cost at least $2,000. Chuck no doubt loved to show off, he even straight up agreed to it. "Thanks. Let's go then, I am so hungry." Laura smiled while holding Conrad's arm and walked to the restaurant. Chuck followed them. The 3 of them found a place in the restaurant and sat down. Soon, the waiter came over with the menu and said, "Good evening. We have a Friday special offer of said dishes here. 3 meat dishes, 1 vegetarian dish, and 1 soup at only $888. Would you like to think about it?" The waiter knew that the 3 of them were all students, so he recommended a cheaper option for them. Laura shook her head hurriedly and pouted, "I don't want to have said dishes." "I don't want it either," Conrad agreed. Laura looked at Chuck and asked cunningly, "Chuck, to thank me, you wouldn't just treat me to said dishes, will you? Chuck said casually. Well, you can order whatever you like. Seriously? Whatever I like? Laura snorted and rolled her eyes. How much do you actually have to ask me to simply order whatever I like? So pretentious. Laura, of course, was more than happy to hear so. She took the menu and pointed at whatever she liked. She ordered a total of 7 dishes, and at this point, even the waiter's expression was a little strange. These dishes were all Triumph Hotel's expensive recommended dishes, costing them around $4,000 to $5,000 in total. Judging that they were students, how could they afford such expensive dishes? He confirmed once more, are you sure you want to order so much? Each dish in Triumph Hotel is not only of great quality, but also of great quantity. Generally speaking, 4 or 5 dishes should be enough for 3 people. Laura looked at Chuck, attempting to sense panic from his expression. She smiled and asked, I'll confirm if you don't have anything to add on? Chuck nodded casually. Yep, that's all. The waiter took a look at Chuck with full of sympathy. At first glance, he knew that Chuck had been ruthlessly conned. Yet, he had no choice but to take the menu and leave. Soon, the dishes were served. There were a lot of dishes, and the 3 of them definitely could not finish them all. Laura ate only 2 pieces of beef before getting more evil idea. Chuck, it seemed I ordered too many dishes. Since there are such lot of dishes here, would you mind if I invite a few friends to come over and eat together? It will be livelier, Chuck said indifferently. Well, it's up to you. Laura looked at Chuck's calm face and sneered in her heart. At this time, he still pretended to be generous. Since there's going to be more people later, it'll be alright if we add on a few more dishes, right? Chuck nodded. Laura and Conrad looked at each other and chuckled. Then they buried their heads in their meals and continued to eat. Not long after, 2 beautiful women came with their boyfriends. Chuck knew these 2 beauties. One was called Moon Charisse and the other was called Tia Thomas. However, he didn't know the 2 men. The 2 of them rushed over after hearing Laura claim that there was an idiot treating them to food at Triumph Hotel. When they came and realized that the idiot was Chuck Cannon, their faces were full of disbelief. Tia sat down and whispered in Laura's ear, Isn't this Chuck? Does he even have any money? Laura said in a low voice, This idiot has a stroke of luck since he picked up a lot of money. Saying this, Laura called over the waiter. The newly came 4 people ordered dishes, which costed around 4 or 5,000. All the dishes cost more than 10,000, and Chuck was pretty sure already dying inside. Laura gloated at Chuck's misery. The dishes were soon served. The 3 couples were eating happily. However, no one spoke to Chuck as they isolated him completely. Chuck had nothing to say either and ate his own food quietly. After a while, since he was almost done with the meal, he called the waiter over. The waiter rushed over with the bill and said respectfully, Sir, the total is $9,302. She looked at Chuck, who was dressed cheaply, and wondered how he was going to pay. Laura, Conrad and the other 4 who came afterwards looked at Chuck maliciously. They were so happy since they wanted to see him make a fool of himself. However, Chuck took out $10,000 in cash from his bag and Laura's eyes shot open. Sure enough, he had picked up $20,000. Conrad and the others were full of bitterness, but even if he was lucky, what could he do? Today, they would force him to spend everything. Chuck took out $3,000 calmly and handed it over to the waiter. After that, he stopped taking out any money anymore. Everyone was stunned and puzzled. Sir, this is $3,000. This is not enough. Laura said, Yeah, it's $9,300. What's wrong with that? You lent me some money, so it is very reasonable for me to treat you, Chuck said calmly. But who are these people? I don't know them. What does their meal have to do with me? Chapter 5. What does their meal have to do with me? What the FK are you saying? Didn't you say it was your treat? I even asked you before ordering, didn't I? When I invited people over, you also agreed to it, and now you're trying to pretend nothing happened. Laura Jean was furious and pointed angrily at Chuck Cannon. Conrad Lee's face darkened. Moon Charisse, Tia Thomas and their boyfriends didn't look well either. They just came here for a free meal and didn't want to pay a penny. Unexpectedly, they encountered such thing. Laura cried out suddenly and everyone in the restaurant stared at them. They were so embarrassed. You've lent me some money, so it is reasonable for me to treat you. Now that I've treated you, settle the rest by yourself. I don't know these people and I don't have the intentions of treating strangers. Chuck stood up. Laura was so angry that she was going crazy. FK, are you trying to play tricks on us? Conrad glared at Chuck. Was he being forced to pay the remaining $6,000 himself? I'm sorry, but I don't know you. Chuck looked at Conrad. He wouldn't have dared to do that previously, but now that he has money, he wasn't afraid of anyone. Conrad stared at Chuck, clenching his fists, but he frowned. Chuck, who used to be timid, was not afraid. This kind of calmness? FK, loser, putting on airs? You don't have money to pay for this meal? Laura burst out in fury. This person is just reluctant to pay. He did it on purpose. This sort of person even exists. If you don't have money, don't put on airs, huh? This is such a disgusting attitude. Moon shook her head angrily. Being looked at by people around her made her feel so ashamed. That's right. What kind of person are you? You refuse to pay for a treat. How could there be such a shameless person like you? It sickens me. Tia was not polite at all. Laura continued chastising Chuck in a blast of rage. FK, you have the guts to dupe me? No matter what, you must pay, whether you want to or not. In that case, that means you'll treat everyone here to a meal? Chuck chuckled. His calmness surprised the people around him. Damn it, are you deaf? When did I say I'll treat them? Why should I treat them? I asked you to pay for us. Laura was so angry that her face turned scarlet. You say you don't want to treat everyone here because you don't know them. Then, why should I treat your friends to a meal? Do I know them? Chuck retorted sharply. Hey. Laura's face was as red as blood. She was going crazy. Moon and Tia's expression twitched. They were angry as well, but they were rendered speechless. Poor FK. You're just a poor FK. Laura cursed incoherently. However, she was immediately shocked by her own words. Chuck glanced at her. A poor FK? If she knew that his mother had given him $5 million casually, would she still think he was a poor FK? The corner of Chuck's mouth curled up and he, accidentally, broke a bowl. With a bang, the bowl was smashed to pieces on the ground. Sir, are you okay? The waiter asked in a hurry. It was normal for customers to break their bowls, but it was a taboo for a customer to be hurt by it. I'm fine. I'm sorry for breaking a bowl. As compensation, keep this. Chuck placed all the remaining money in the hands of the dumbfounded waiter. Sir, this. The waiter was stunned. It was just a bowl, and this guest compensated over $7,000? The customers around them were shocked. A $7,000 bowl? And this was still considered poor? He was totally a baller. Conrad's eyes widened in disbelief. How could he spend $7,000 on a bowl that probably cost only $2 to $3? Did he really pick up just $20,000? Moon and Tia were even more dumbfounded. $8,000 was their living expenses for 2 months. How could he just give it away like that?